The theory of evolution by natural deception. Hello, Roddy Bullock here, founder of Creation Reformation, and your host for today's video where I will relate a recent conversation I had with an evolutionist that reveals the deep deception of natural selection. Let me explain. At Creation Reformation, we assert and defend a statement that we call the natural selection paradox, and here it is. Every current species evolved from a first life form solely by cumulative random evolutionary change. Now, if you ponder that statement for a few moments, you will realize that if this statement is true, then it completely destroys the theory of evolution by natural selection as a scientific explanation for all current species. And I am asserting that this statement must be true if evolutionary theory is true. That is, if the theory of evolution by natural selection correctly explains the existence of every current species, then this statement must be true. But as we will see in this video, this statement cannot be defended scientifically. Thus, the paradox, the natural selection paradox, because despite natural selection's role in nature, this statement must be true. Now, if you would like a full explanation of how we derived the current natural selection paradox, I invite you to go to our YouTube channel and look for a YouTube video entitled Dropping the Bomb on Evolution. In this video, we give a full and complete rational and scientific explanation for how we derived the current version of the natural selection paradox. Now, this version was not the original version of the natural selection paradox. The natural selection paradox has evolved over time as we interact with evolutionists and we hone our arguments and we hone the natural selection paradox. Most recently, in a video like Dropping the Bomb on Evolution, we were defending the previous version of the natural selection paradox, and a very well-informed and polite evolutionist, a rare combination on the internet these days, contacted me by email and convinced me that that version of the natural selection paradox was not entirely accurate. Now, here is the version of the natural selection paradox that I was defending in that previous video. And if you would like to see how a very well-informed evolutionist convinced me that I was wrong and I had to change my mind, I invite you to go to my Substack page and look for a post called Natural Selection, a Scarecrow in a Cucumber Patch. There you will find a summary of the email exchanges between me and this evolutionist where he convinced me that I was wrong. He convinced me specifically that there was a problem with this version of the natural selection paradox around this phrase, played no role. And he convinced me that there was an indirect role that natural selection plays, and so my statement was not entirely accurate. In fact, it was wrong. So I went back to the drawing board and I developed two new statements to propose to this evolutionist as new natural selection paradoxes, and here's the note I sent. I am kicking around some reworked statements and would like to get your opinion. Would you agree that these two statements are true statements? The second expands on the first. If not, why not, aside from your concerns with the term random? Now, let me explain a bit. I presented two statements to him. We are going to look at one. And that note about random, we had had many email exchanges, and we had gone down a rabbit trail of the use of the term random as the most accurate term for genetic mutations and genetic variation. That's a topic for another video. I am sticking with the term random, and here is the statement that I presented him with. I will call my friend Tom. Now, this you will recognize as the current natural selection paradox with this phrase in front of it, despite natural selection's role in nature. And Tom replied, "Glad to hear from you. The statements look fine to me, so long as they are understood as consistent with natural selection playing this indirect role that he exposed in making certain genetic sequences emerge, not merely eliminating genetic sequences." Now, I was a little surprised that Tom found this statement fine. In fact, in future emails, he agreed that it was true, as we will see, but he added this: "There's nothing controversial there, and there's nothing that is paradoxical for evolutionary theory." I responded to Tom, "I appreciate your thoughts. The statements are indeed consistent with natural selection playing an indirect role, but the indirect role does not change the controversial nature of the statements. Taking the first statement, which is this statement up here, it is equally true without the nod to natural selection. That is, we can strike this phrase here, and the remainder of this statement remains true. In fact, you will notice that this is the current natural selection paradox that I am defending." And I said to Tom, "In my view, this statement should be very controversial. That true statement," and keep in mind when I say a true statement, this is a statement that must be true if evolutionary theory is true. That true statement cannot be defended scientifically. So now Tom and I are going to begin a discussion about the scientific basis for believing that this statement can be true. Before we get there, I want to share with you to make it clear why I believe this statement cannot be defended scientifically, and that is to take it out of the context of evolution. In the context of evolution, very often, let's just say, strange and possibly absurd statements are taken as truth. But when the same statement is applied by analogy in a different context, the absurdity can be seen. So, for example, this statement in a different context could read like this: despite an inspector removing some copies, every current book on Earth was produced from a first book solely by cumulative random duplicating changes. Okay, these statements are identical in their meaning, just in different contexts. And I am asking Tom, what is his basis for believing this statement can be defended scientifically? Tom replied, "We know it's true." He's saying we know this statement is true, since we observe adaptations arising by random mutations in the present day. Now, what Tom is alluding to is something that I agree with, and that is that we do observe some beneficial genetic mutations that cause beneficial adaptations in some organisms. And this is a fact that I don't deny, and that's what Tom is saying here as the basis for him believing that this statement can be true. So Tom and I both believe that this statement is true. And now we just need to find out why he believes it has a scientific basis, and I'm going to submit it does not. So I asked Tom, do you have a scientific law or principle that explains, and I'm missing a word, how such a massive directional increase in functional complexity could arise solely from random changes to less functional complexity? Now, there's a lot of words here, but this is based on some previous conversations that Tom and I had, where we agreed that if evolutionary theory is true, it has to explain how the relatively less functional complexity of early genetic codes, genotypes and phenotypes, could arise solely from random changes to become the massive relatively increased functional complexity in current genetic codes of current species. Okay, that's the basis. We don't have to worry too much about this. I'm asking for a scientific law or principle that explains this statement and makes it believable scientifically. Tom replies, all that's needed is a scientific theory for how it happens that's supported by strong evidence. And now here we're going to examine Tom's response, and we're going to see the light of why Tom is deceived by natural selection. First, let's take this statement, and in other statements, and I invite you to go to that natural selection, a scarecrow and a cucumber patch post on my Substack where I have the full transcript. But you will see that Tom is relying strongly on these observations that we see in nature. And I don't deny that observation is important. In fact, observation is necessary in scientific inquiry. Observation is the start of any scientific inquiry. But observation is not the end of scientific inquiry. Let me explain. We can all agree that there was a time in the past when there were various theories about planetary motion. And in fact, early on, based on observation alone, some people standing on the Earth and looking up argued that the sun is orbiting about the Earth. Other people, based on observations, proposed a theory that no, it's actually the Earth is orbiting the sun. Both of these theories of planetary motion were held by scientists for centuries. In fact, up until the 16th century, everything we knew about planetary motion was based on observation. And the scientists that held the geocentric theory of planetary motion and the scientists that held the heliocentric theory of planetary motion each could claim that their scientific theory is supported by strong evidence. They each have observations that support their theories of planetary motion. But it wasn't until Isaac Newton developed some scientific laws, specifically, he developed the laws of motion and the law of gravity, that ended the debate about planetary motion. Because what the laws of motion and the law of gravity do is impose natural laws onto these observations to make only one of them a true theory. That is, these laws of motion and the law of gravity explain not what is observed, but how what is observed is made to happen, why it's true. So the planets don't orbit the sun randomly. They are not being pushed around by angels. The planets orbit the sun because scientific laws demand that they do so. In scientific terms, the planetary motion is non-contingent. Planets don't have a choice. They must go in the motion demanded by these scientific laws. So in effect, or not in effect, what I am asking Tom is, what is the scientific principle that can support, and again, I'm describing basically what has to happen to make this statement true up here. Do you have a scientific law or principle that explains this? That's what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for observations. We all have observations. And we can all be led to various theories based on our observations. But a scientific law demands that certain observations be rejected and certain be accepted. And I'm asking Tom, what is the scientific law that makes this a believably scientific statement? Now, suffice it to say that Tom could not come up with a scientific law. In fact, there is no scientific law that would make this statement scientifically believable or scientifically true. In fact, there are scientific laws that must be violated for a statement like this to be true. But the reason that Tom will not let go of his belief that this statement can be true is related to his deep reliance, his unshakable reliance that somehow natural selection can make the impossible possible. Let me explain. Let's go back to that first exchange that I showed. This is what we started with in our, as I showed you, our exchange by email between me and Tom. Let's review Tom's reply one more time, and I want to show you how deeply ingrained a deception of natural selection can be. Tom agrees that this statement is true, and this statement is true regardless of the presence or the operation of natural selection or not. And Tom agreed to that. But in this statement, which is consistent with all of his statements, he says the statements look fine to me so long as they are understood as consistent with natural selection playing an indirect role in making certain genetic sequences emerge, not merely eliminating genetic sequences. Before I show the flaw in Tom's thinking, let me just say, this is very common in my experience. I've had many, maybe up to 100 discussions with evolutionists, primarily online, where I can lead them through a Socratic question and answer method and get them to agree that statements like this must be true if evolutionary theory is true, which renders the whole theory absurd. But they will not let go of their belief. And it's because, despite what they say, they cannot let go of the idea that somehow natural selection is the magic that makes the method work. Natural selection is the secret sauce that brings order out of disorder. Natural selection is the key that somehow mysteriously makes new genetic codes out of old genetic codes. Let me explain based on Tom's answer. He says the statement is fine as long as it's consistent with natural selection playing an indirect role in making certain genetic sequences emerge. Now, Tom knows what he's talking about. And I'm going to ask a question. And if I caught this in time while exchanging this with Tom, I would ask him. Maybe in the future he can reply, but I will ask you. Does natural selection make certain genetic sequences emerge? We know where genetic sequences come from. It is uncontroversial that new genetic sequences arise on Earth from one and only one source, and that is in the offspring, from parent to offspring replication with genetic variation, heritable genetic change, genetic mutations that arise in the phenotypes of offspring. That is the only source. That is the only natural source and the only source of any kind on Earth where new genetic sequences emerge. So I would assert that natural selection does not make certain genetic sequences emerge. In fact, it's equally uncontroversial that there is only one thing that natural selection does, and that is that natural selection makes certain genetic sequences disappear. All natural selection does is eliminate some of the genetic sequences that emerged from genetic mutation and leave others to continue their survival and reproduction. So natural selection doesn't make certain genetic sequences emerge. Natural selection makes certain genetic sequences disappear forever. So Tom's inability to find a scientific reason to believe this statement can be true is rescued, in a sense, in his mind by believing that somehow indirectly the magic of natural selection makes this statement true. I am going to assert that that doesn't rise to a scientific explanation, and I would invite anyone who has made it this far in the video to ponder this statement. Go to the video in which I explained its derivation. That was called Dropping the Bomb on Evolution. And if you cannot explain to me at the email address below why this statement is not true, then a rational person would and should reject evolutionary theory as an explanation for all current species. And I would invite you to do so. Now, if I've done things right, on the next screen, well, first I'm going to show you again this Substack post, natural selection, a scarecrow in a cucumber patch. But now, if I've done things right, on the next screen, you will see a link to that video dropping the bomb on evolution, and as well a little icon of our natural selection paradox that you can click on to subscribe to this channel. I hope you will. In any event, don't be deceived by the deep deception of natural selection. And until next time, I will say goodbye and good day.